I am Sienna, 32 years old, and a director at a venture capital firm in San Francisco. My family always viewed me as a walking bank account rather than a daughter. The breaking point happened when my mother looked me dead in the eye and said, "Your sister owes $900,000 and you are paying it, or you are no longer our child." I looked at her, then at my father, and simply replied, "Then I am not." I called my bank that very night to secure my assets. 5 days later, my phone was blowing up with 120 missed calls from my family begging and pleading for mercy. I did not listen to a single voicemail. I only sent one text message in response. Too late. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to stand up to toxic family members who tried to use you. This journey is about setting absolute boundaries and watching karma take its natural devastating course. Growing up in a wealthy suburb of Connecticut, my family projected an image of absolute perfection to the outside world. My father, Harold, was a former bank manager who valued his country club reputation and social standing above all else. My mother, Eleanor, was a master of emotional manipulation, always playing the victim to get her way and control the narrative. And then there was my younger sister Melanie, the undisputed golden child, who could do no wrong in their eyes. I was the designated black sheep, simply because I demanded independence focused on my education and refused to play their exhausting psychological games. I had flown back to Connecticut under the strict assumption that we were celebrating my parents' 40th wedding anniversary. I rented a car at the airport and drove to their sprawling estate, bringing an incredibly expensive bottle of vintage wine as a celebratory gift. I had genuinely hoped for a peaceful weekend, a rare moment of family unity to briefly escape the high-pressure environment of Silicon Valley. I should have known better than to expect peace. The moment I walked through the heavy oak front doors, the atmosphere felt incredibly hostile and heavy. There were no festive decorations, no caterers setting up in the kitchen, and absolutely no signs of an anniversary celebration. Instead, the grand entryway was dead silent until my mother stormed around the corner from the formal living room. She did not say hello, she did not offer a motherly hug or ask about my flight. Her face was flushed red with anger, and before I could even set my travel bags down, she threw a thick manila folder directly at my chest. The heavy folder hit me hard, bursting open and spilling dozens of financial statements, final default notices, and aggressive letters from debt collectors across the polished marble floor. I looked down at the scattered papers in absolute confusion, my eyes catching phrases like immediate foreclosure and asset seizure. My mother glared at me, her hands planted firmly on her hips, her breathing heavy. In the background, I could hear the exaggerated dramatic sobbing of my sister Melanie coming from the custom leather sofa in the sunken living room. I stepped past the scattered financial papers and walked slowly into the living room to assess the situation. Melanie was curled up in a ball, clutching a designer tissue, wearing a silk lounge outfit that probably cost more than my first car. My father, Harold, stood by the massive stone fireplace, his arms crossed tightly over his chest, projecting his usual authoritarian and intimidating demeanor. I asked what exactly was going on, keeping my voice as level and professional as I do during tense board meetings at my venture capital firm. My father did not hesitate or offer any gentle explanation. He pointed a stern finger at me and announced that Melanie was in massive financial trouble. He stated that she was drowning in debt, actively being hunted by aggressive creditors, and facing the immediate seizure of all her personal assets. "Where is Malik?" I asked, referring to Melanie's husband. Malik is a brilliant and hardworking African-American architect, a man with genuine integrity, who I always deeply respected. I knew Malik would never allow their household finances to reach this catastrophic point without fighting to fix it. My mother scoffed loudly, stepping into the room behind me and crossing her arms. She snapped that Malik did not know the full extent of the situation and that they were trying to handle this massive debt privately before his architectural firm found out, and the scandal ruined his career. The truth, which I would soon discover, was that Melanie had been hiding her reckless spending from her husband for years. She had completely fabricated a complex story about losing money in cryptocurrency investments to cover her tracks. Right now, she was just playing the role of a terrified victim to escape accountability. I looked at the papers on the floor again, noting the terrifying red ink and the aggressive legal threats from various lending institutions. I asked exactly how much money we were talking about. Melanie wailed louder, burying her face deeper into the expensive throw pillows. My father stepped forward, his expression hardening into solid stone. He looked me dead in the eye and said, "She owes $900,000. The number echoed loudly in the large vaulted room. $900,000. It was an astronomical, life-ruining sum for a 28-year-old woman who had never held a steady job in her entire life. I stared at my family, the harsh reality of the ambush finally sinking into my mind. There was no anniversary dinner planned. There was no celebration of their marriage. I had been summoned across the country under false pretenses for one specific reason. They needed a massive financial bailout, and they had collectively decided I was the only one who could provide it. I stood my ground in the center of the living room, refusing to show even a hint of vulnerability. I asked them how they expected me to miraculously resolve a nearly $1 million disaster that Melanie had created entirely on her own through sheer negligence. My father did not miss a beat. His tone was cold and commanding, the exact corporate voice he used to terminate employees back when he managed the bank. He stated that I had a trust fund from my late grandfather. He knew exactly what was in that account and how much it had grown. He demanded that I liquidate $3 million from the irrevocable trust, withdraw the $900,000, and wire it directly to Melanie's creditors immediately. He framed this outrageous demand not as a request, but as an absolute family obligation. I felt a cold, bitter laugh rising in my throat. I looked directly at my father and informed him that I could not just drain an irrevocable trust fund on a whim to cover someone else's gambling and shopping debts. I explained the complex fiduciary duties involved and the strict legal penalties for early withdrawal. Furthermore, I stated that I had already locked those funds into long-term venture capital investments in San Francisco. The money was securely tied up in seed rounds for promising tech startups and could not be liquidated without suffering catastrophic financial penalties and breaching my professional contracts with my partners. My father's face turned purple with sudden rage. He slammed his hand against the stone mantelpiece, insisting that I was lying to protect my wealth, while my own sister was facing utter ruin and potential legal charges. He yelled that family comes first, and that I had a moral duty to save her from the streets. When he realized I was not going to budge an inch on the trust fund, he quickly pivoted to his meticulously planned backup strategy. He knew I owned a luxury apartment in San Francisco, a prime piece of real estate I had purchased after my first major success as a venture capital director. He pointed his finger at me again and demanded that I take out a second mortgage on my apartment. He ordered me to leverage my own home, the sanctuary I had built for myself, to generate the cash for Melanie's bailout. My mother chimed in, her voice dripping with calculated emotional manipulation. She claimed that I had so much success, and Melanie had so little luck in the world. She accused me of being greedy, selfish, and heartless for hoarding my money. She cried that Melanie was terrified that she might lose her home, and that Malik would definitely leave her and take everything if he found out the truth about the debt. My mother stepped closer to me, trying to use physical proximity to intimidate me into submission. She said I could easily afford the massive monthly payments on a second mortgage with my high corporate salary. She told me I would not even notice the money was gone, but it would literally save my sister's life and preserve the family honor. I stared at them in sheer disbelief. They were actively demanding that I risk my own financial stability, leverage my home, and jeopardize my career to cover the massive debts of a sister who refused to work a single day in her life. I told them absolutely not. I stated clearly and firmly that I would not mortgage my property, I would not touch my investments, and I would not pay a single cent toward Melanie's reckless mistakes. Melanie stopped crying instantly. The fake tears vanished, replaced by a look of pure venomous entitlement. She sat up on the couch, her face dry, and screamed that it was not fair. She yelled that I always got everything I wanted, that I was hoarding wealth while she was suffering, and that I owed her this money because I was the older sister and supposed to take care of her. The sheer audacity of her statement took my breath away. My father stepped into my personal space, trying to tower over me and use his physical size to force my compliance. He warned me that I was crossing a line from which there was no return. He told me that this family protects its own, and if I refused to act like family, I would be treated like a complete outsider. He delivered his final ultimatum with a voice shaking with absolute rage. He said, "You are paying this debt right now, or you are no longer our child. If you walk away from your sister today, you are dead to us." My mother nodded in fierce agreement, wiping her completely dry eyes and looking at me with pure disdain. She added that I would be officially written out of their wills, banned from all future family gatherings, and completely erased from their lives forever. They stood there, a unified front of toxicity, fully expecting me to crumble under the pressure. They expected the terrible threat of disownment to break my spirit and force me into financial submission. They genuinely thought I still craved their conditional approval enough to buy it for $900,000. I did not crumble. Instead, the years of suppressed exhaustion and frustration finally reached a boiling point. I looked at my sister wearing her designer clothes, and then at my parents standing in their multi-million-dollar mansion. I asked them how they dared to speak to me about fairness, sacrifice, and family support. I reminded them that when I went to college, they blatantly refused to pay a single dollar toward my tuition because they deemed my choice of study unprofitable. I told them how I worked 3 different jobs just to afford my textbooks and rent in a tiny shared apartment. I recounted the sleepless nights working as a barista, manning the campus library desk, and doing overnight data entry, all while maintaining a perfect grade point average. I paid off every single cent of my massive student loans by myself without asking them for a dime. Then I turned my attention directly to Melanie. I pointed out that while I was drowning in student debt and eating ramen noodles, they bought Melanie a brand new luxury car just for barely graduating high school with terrible grades. I reminded them of the time Melanie racked up $50,000 in credit card debt at age 22, and my father quietly paid it off from his retirement account without a word of reprimand. I brought up the time she failed out of her interior design course at age 25, and my mother bought her a luxury condo to make her feel better about quitting. I threw their long history of blatant favoritism right back in their stunned faces. "You want me to pay her debts?" I asked, my voice deadly calm. "You paid for her entire life. You funded her massive entitlement. You shielded her from every single consequence she ever faced. And now that she has finally created a disaster too big for your bank accounts to handle, you expect me to sacrifice my home to fix it?" My mother gasped, clutching her chest, as if my words physically wounded her. She cried that I was holding on to ancient grudges, that I was living in the past, and that I was a cruel and unforgiving person who hated her own sister. My father stepped forward, his face inches from mine, and shouted that I had to earn my way because I was stubborn and difficult, while Melanie needed their protection because she was sensitive. He actually admitted his favoritism out loud, justifying his toxic parenting by claiming my fierce independence was a severe character flaw rather than a strength. I told them that their endless protection had turned Melanie into a parasite. I stated that her $900,000 debt was the direct, unavoidable result of their terrible parenting. They had taught her that money had no meaning, actions had no consequences, and that someone else would always be forced to clean up her mess. I looked Melanie directly in the eyes and told her that the free ride was officially over. I was not her backup plan, I was not her insurance policy, and I would never be her personal bank. My father's face contorted with a kind of blind rage I had never seen before. He realized he was losing complete control of the situation and losing access to my money. He pointed toward the heavy front door, his hand visibly shaking with fury. He screamed that I was not leaving this house until I agreed to sign the paperwork for the mortgage transfer. He yelled that if I walked out that door, the family ties were severed forever. He repeated his ultimate threat, emphasizing every vicious word. "You are no longer our child." The grand room fell entirely silent save for his heavy, ragged breathing. They waited for me to break to apologize for my disrespect, to back down and beg for their conditional love. I looked at my mother, whose face was a mask of cold, calculating judgment. I looked at Melanie, who was glaring at me with pure, unadulterated hatred. Finally, I looked at my father. I felt no sadness, no fear, and absolutely no hesitation. The invisible chains of family obligation that had weighed me down for 32 years simply snapped. I met his furious gaze and replied with complete calm, "Then I am not." I turned around and walked away. I did not look back. I left the vintage bottle of anniversary wine sitting untouched on the entryway table. I walked out the heavy oak doors and stepped into the crisp Connecticut air. Behind me, I could hear my father screaming threats from the doorway, shouting that I would regret this, that I would die alone, and that I would never be welcome in their home again. His voice echoed across the manicured lawn, but it sounded incredibly small and pathetic to me now. I got into my rental car, started the engine, and drove down the long, winding driveway. As the iron gates of the estate closed behind me, a profound sense of liberation washed over my entire body. I had finally drawn the absolute boundary I should have drawn a decade ago. I pulled over at a nearby coffee shop, opened my laptop, and began making immediate arrangements to return to San Francisco. I knew they would not stop here. People like my parents and sister do not just accept defeat when almost $1 million is on the line. I called my bank, my corporate lawyers, and my firm's security team that very night to lock down all my accounts and monitor my credit. I was preparing for a war they thought they had already won. What they did not know was that by disowning me, they had unleashed a version of me that was no longer bound by family loyalty or social pleasantries. The real conflict was just beginning. The 6-hour flight from Connecticut back to San Francisco felt like a blur of cold adrenaline and calculated planning. I did not sleep a single minute on that plane. Instead, I connected to the in-flight Wi-Fi and began auditing my own life. I checked my bank balances, reviewed my venture capital portfolios, and drafted preemptive emails to my security team. I thought I was being paranoid. I thought I was overreacting to the rantings of a desperate man. I was completely wrong. My father was a former bank manager, a man who spent his entire career finding leverage and exploiting fine print. He did not just throw tantrums, he executed hostile takeovers. I landed at San Francisco International Airport just as the sun was rising over the bay. I hailed a premium rideshare and headed straight to my luxury apartment building in the financial district. This was my sanctuary. I had purchased the penthouse unit after closing my first massive tech acquisition. It was the physical proof of my success, a place where no one from my past could reach me. I walked into the marble lobby, nodded to the morning concierge who gave me a strangely nervous look, and took the private elevator up to my floor. I stood in front of my heavy mahogany door, dropped my overnight bag, and reached for the digital smart lock pad. I typed in my 6-digit passcode. The keypad beeped sharply and flashed a solid red light. Access denied. I frowned, assuming I had simply miskeyed the numbers in my exhaustion. I cleared the screen and typed the code again, pressing each number deliberately. Red light. Access denied. I pulled out my phone and opened the smart home application that controlled the entire apartment. The app immediately kicked me back to the login screen. When I tried to authenticate with my facial recognition, a stark error message popped up stating my administrative privileges had been revoked by the primary account holder. My blood ran completely cold. I did not have a primary account holder. I owned this unit. I paid the mortgage. I paid the exorbitant homeowner association fees. I marched straight back to the elevator and took it down to the management office on the ground floor. I demanded to see the building supervisor immediately. The manager, a usually cheerful man named David, looked at me with deep discomfort. He invited me into his office and closed the door. He nervously explained that he had received an emergency legal directive early that morning from my co-signer. I stared at him in absolute shock. I told him I did not have a cosigner. David slowly turned his computer monitor toward me and pointed to a scanned legal document. It was the original deed and mortgage agreement from 5 years ago. When I first moved to San Francisco to start my career as a venture capital director, I had the cash for the down payment, but I lacked the localized credit history required by this ultra-exclusive building board. My father, Harold, had offered to co-sign the initial paperwork just to push the approval through the board. It was supposed to be a temporary formality. I paid off the entire mortgage balance 3 years ago. I owned the property outright. But in my relentless focus on building my career and managing billion-dollar tech funds, I had made one catastrophic administrative error. I never filed the official addendum to remove his name from the secondary access rights on the property deed. David apologized profusely, keeping his voice low. He explained that my father had called the management office at 4 in the morning Pacific time. Harold had utilized his background in banking to invoke a highly specific security clause in the building's bylaws. He claimed there was a severe family emergency, stated that my mental health was severely compromised, and exercised his legal right as the co-signer to secure the property. He had legally ordered the building management to wipe all existing passcodes, disable the smart home application, and lock the unit down completely. Because his name was still technically on the deed as a guarantor, the building management had their hands tied by local real estate laws. They had to comply with his emergency directive until a court ordered otherwise. I stood in that management office, the reality of my father's viciousness washing over me in freezing waves. He had not just threatened to disown me. He had actively moved to leave me homeless on the streets of San Francisco. While I was sitting on a plane flying across the country, he was ruthlessly leveraging a 5-year-old administrative loophole to seize control of my multi-million-dollar asset. He knew exactly what he was doing. He wanted to strip away my safety, my shelter, and my dignity. He wanted to break me down so completely that I would have no choice but to crawl back to Connecticut and beg for my own keys. I thanked David for his time, picked up my travel bag, and walked back out into the lobby. I was locked out of my own home, wearing the same clothes from yesterday, with nowhere to go. I took a deep breath, refusing to let the panic take root. I stepped through the sliding glass doors of my building and out onto the brisk San Francisco street. The morning fog was rolling in off the bay, matching the icy chill settling deep in my chest. Before I could even signal for a black car, my phone vibrated violently in my coat pocket. I pulled it out and stared at the glowing screen. It was a single text message from my father. There was no greeting, no explanation, and certainly no apology for stranding his daughter on the street. The message contained exactly 4 words. Keys cost $900,000. I read the text again, my vision tunneling as the sheer audacity of his extortion attempt washed over me. He was holding my home hostage for ransom. He genuinely believed that stripping me of my shelter would break my resolve and force me to empty my accounts to save Melanie. I did not reply. Responding to a terrorist only validates their tactics. I took a screenshot of the message, immediately forwarding it to my encrypted cloud drive. This was no longer a family dispute. It was a documented case of financial extortion. I hailed a passing luxury car and instructed the driver to take me to the Four Seasons. I needed a secure base of operations, and I needed it immediately. The ride to the hotel felt agonizingly slow. I leaned my head against the cold leather window, watching the familiar city streets blur past. The physical toll of the betrayal was finally beginning to set in. My muscles ached from the tension of the flight and the confrontation in Connecticut. My jaw was tight from clenching my teeth. I walked into the grand lobby of the hotel, ignoring the curious glances at my wrinkled travel clothes, and approached the front desk. I handed the receptionist my corporate platinum card and requested their best available executive suite for an indefinite stay. Within 10 minutes, I was riding the elevator up to the top floor, clutching a sleek magnetic keycard. The suite was immaculate, smelling of expensive citrus room spray and fresh linens. It was beautiful, but it was incredibly sterile. It was not my home. I dropped my overnight bag onto the pristine white duvet and stood in the center of the room. The silence was deafening. Without the adrenaline of the immediate confrontation keeping me upright, my knees suddenly felt weak. I sank onto the edge of the mattress, burying my face in my hands. My father had reached across the country and violated the one place where I felt entirely safe. He had weaponized a piece of paper from 5 years ago to execute a calculated strike against my independence. I began to pace the length of the hotel suite, my heels sinking into the thick carpet. I needed to process the magnitude of what had just occurred. Harold was not just protecting his favorite child anymore. He was actively destroying his other child to do it. He viewed me as a highly lucrative asset that had suddenly malfunctioned and needed to be forcefully rebooted. The emotional violence of the act was staggering. He did not care where I slept. He did not care if I was safe. He only cared about extracting the funds necessary to preserve the illusion of his perfect family in Connecticut. I walked over to the minibar, poured myself a glass of sparkling water, and drank it down in one go. The cold liquid grounded me. I realized that crying over this betrayal would be a massive waste of energy. My family had played their opening move. They expected me to panic, to call them in tears, to negotiate a surrender. They expected the obedient, approval-seeking daughter to resurface. Instead, they were about to face a venture capital director who specialized in hostile takeovers and crisis management. I walked over to the heavy oak desk by the window, pulled my laptop from my travel bag, and plugged it into the wall. I opened the screen and let the bright light illuminate the dark hotel room. It was time to stop reacting and start dismantling them. I logged into my encrypted financial portal, my fingers flying across the keyboard with practiced precision. My first priority was to lock down my liquid assets and ensure my father had not somehow bypassed my banking security. I transferred funds, changed administrative passwords, and established a new two-factor authentication protocol that completely bypassed my regular cell phone number. I knew the terrifying lengths desperate people would go to, and a SIM swap was a common tactic in financial fraud. My checking accounts were secure. My venture capital portfolios were untouched, locked safely behind layers of corporate security and fiduciary firewalls. I let out a sharp breath, feeling a momentary wave of relief wash over me in the quiet hotel room. Then my phone vibrated violently against the mahogany desk. It was not another extortion text from my father. It was an urgent push notification from my premium credit monitoring service. A stark red exclamation point dominated the screen. The notification read, "Critical alert, new account opened, credit utilization warning." I frowned, clicking the notification, and logging into the monitoring dashboard using my biometric identification. The screen loaded, and my stomach plummeted straight through the floor of the hotel suite. My credit score, a pristine and meticulously maintained 820, a number I absolutely needed for regulatory compliance in my high-stakes industry, had plummeted by over 160 points in a matter of weeks. I immediately pulled up the full detailed credit report. The screen was an absolute sea of aggressive red flags and derogatory marks. There were 6 newly opened accounts listed. None of them belonged to me. There was a platinum credit card issued by a major bank in New York, currently maxed out at $85,000. There was a personal signature loan from a boutique lending firm in Connecticut for $150,000. There was an active auto financing loan for a luxury sports car and 3 more high-yield credit lines that had been completely drained of their available balances within days of being opened. I grabbed a notepad from the hotel desk and started scribbling the numbers furiously. The fraudulent debt totaled well over $400,000, all opened within the last 45 days. This was not the $900,000 disaster my father had yelled about in the living room. This was entirely new active debt bleeding out in my name. I stared at the screen, my mind racing through the strict security protocols I had in place. How was this even possible? Then the sickening realization hit me like a physical blow to the chest. Melanie. My sister did not just share my DNA, she shared my entire history. She knew the answers to every single standard security question a financial institution could ever ask. She knew my mother's maiden name, the exact name of the street we grew up on, the name of my first pet, and the make and model of my first car. More dangerously, my original Social Security card had been kept in a fireproof safe in my father's home office for years. My old mail, including pre-approved credit card offers and tax documents from when I first started college, still occasionally arrived at their Connecticut address. Melanie had unfettered direct access to my entire personal identity. While she was playing the weeping, helpless victim on my parents' custom leather sofa, she had been actively impersonating me across state lines. She had forged my signature, stolen my social security number, and systematically drained my financial reputation to fund her secret lifestyle and stave off her own aggressive creditors. Did my father know? The thought made my hands shake with a new, terrifying kind of rage. Harold was a former bank manager. He knew exactly how credit applications were processed and approved. He knew the devastating long-term consequences of identity theft. The violent demand for the $900,000 from my trust fund was not just an extortion attempt to save his favorite child. It was a calculated cover-up. They were trying to force me to liquidate my trust fund to quietly absorb this fraudulent debt before the banks caught on and pressed federal charges against his golden child. He had locked me out of my apartment to create maximum panic, hoping I would pay the ransom before I ever checked my credit report. I pushed my chair back from the desk and stood up, my breathing shallow and fast. The sheer scale of the violation was suffocating. They had not just locked me out of my home. They had literally stolen my name. They had weaponized my impeccable professional reputation to finance Melanie's reckless, entitled existence. This was no longer just a toxic family dynamic or a petty dispute over sibling favoritism. This was a calculated, deliberate, and massive federal crime. The cold, analytical venture capitalist inside me immediately took the wheel, pushing the shock and grief aside. I sat back down, picked up the hotel phone, and bypassed the front desk entirely. I dialed the direct, unlisted number for my personal wealth manager at my primary bank. I did not shed a single tear. I did not shake. My voice was absolute ice. I instructed my manager to initiate a comprehensive fraud lockdown on my entire identity. I ordered a hard permanent freeze on all 3 major credit bureaus. I mandated that no new accounts, no wire transfers, and no credit inquiries be authorized without my physical in-person verification and a secondary biometric scan. I hung up the phone and stared at the glowing screen of my laptop, looking at the massive trail of debt my sister had left in my name. Melanie thought she could use my identity as her personal automated teller machine. She thought she could hide behind our parents' money influence and endless protection. She had made a fatal, arrogant miscalculation. She had left a massive, undeniable digital paper trail of her felony across multiple financial institutions. I was not going to pay a single cent of her debt. I was going to use this paper trail to absolutely destroy her. I was not going to pay a single cent of her debt. I was going to use this paper trail to absolutely destroy her. Just as the adrenaline of my decision solidified into cold resolve, my secure corporate phone began to vibrate violently against the heavy oak desk. It was a restricted number, but the distinct double vibration pattern indicated an internal priority call from my venture capital firm. I glanced at the digital clock on the hotel nightstand. It was barely 6 in the morning in San Francisco. A call at this hour meant a catastrophe. I answered the phone with my standard professional greeting, suppressing any hint of the exhaustion threatening to pull me under. The voice on the other end belonged to Colin, our chief compliance officer. Colin was a man who spoke exclusively in the language of liabilities risk assessments and federal regulations. He did not bother with pleasantries or asking how my trip back to Connecticut had been. He immediately informed me that our firm's continuous automated background monitoring system had triggered a severe red flag on my executive profile right at midnight. As a director managing a $500 million technology fund, my personal financial integrity was a matter of strict regulatory compliance. In the high-stakes venture capital sector, if a fund manager suddenly acquires massive amounts of unverified debt or experiences a sudden drop in their creditworthiness, they instantly become a high-risk liability to the firm. Extreme unexplained debt makes an executive vulnerable to corporate blackmail, bribery, and catastrophic breaches of fiduciary duty. Colin kept his voice clinically detached as he read off the alerts glowing on his monitor. The compliance software had detected over $400,000 in newly originated high-yield debt across multiple unverified accounts, accompanied by a catastrophic plummet in my credit score. By standard corporate protocol, Colin was legally required to formally suspend my trading privileges, freeze my communications with our portfolio companies, and initiate an immediate internal investigation. A suspension would be an absolute death sentence for my career. I was currently in the final stages of closing the lead investment round for a highly anticipated artificial intelligence startup. If I was sidelined now, the startup founders would panic, the limited partners would pull their capital out of fear, and my reputation in Silicon Valley would be permanently burned. The industry thrives on flawless optics and moves entirely on trust. A fraud investigation, even if I was eventually cleared of all wrongdoing, would leave a permanent toxic stain on my name. Gossip spreads down Sand Hill Road faster than a wildfire, and the mere whisper of financial instability would make me unemployable. I stood frozen by the hotel window looking out over the waking city as the true, horrifying depth of my family's strategy finally clicked into place. This was not just Melanie being a careless, entitled shopaholic who got in over her head. Melanie was nowhere near smart enough to execute a coordinated credit attack of this magnitude on her own. She might have physically submitted the fraudulent applications using my stolen social security number, but the timing, the specific types of loans chosen, and the sheer speed of the execution had the meticulous calculating fingerprints of a seasoned banking professional all over them. My father. Harold knew exactly what these derogatory marks would do to my career. He had spent decades approving and denying loans, and he understood the strict financial compliance laws governing investment directors better than anyone. He had orchestrated this entire scenario to systematically dismantle the foundation of my independence. If I lost my position at the firm, I would lose my corporate income. If I lost my income, I could not afford the mortgage and maintenance on my luxury apartment, the very apartment he had just legally locked me out of. He was intentionally creating a perfect storm of financial ruin to force my hand. He wanted me desperate, unemployed, homeless, and facing federal scrutiny. He calculated that the sheer terror of losing my hard-earned career would break my spirit entirely. He expected me to panic and voluntarily liquidate my grandfather's $3 million trust fund to pay off the debts just to make the compliance red flags disappear before my firm fired me. He was actively trying to destroy my entire life so he could harvest the pieces to fund my sister's extravagant lifestyle and protect his own country club image. The realization was sickening. They did not just view me as a bank account, they viewed me as collateral damage. I gripped the phone tightly and interrupted Colin before he could formally read me my suspension notice. I kept my voice absolutely unwavering, projecting the cold authority of a woman who managed millions of dollars every single day. I informed my chief compliance officer that I was the victim of a highly sophisticated, targeted identity theft ring. I stated that none of the flagged accounts belonged to me, and I was currently in a secure location coordinating with authorities to resolve the breach. I deliberately did not mention my family. In business, personal drama is a glaring weakness, but identity theft is a recognized corporate hazard that requires a procedural response. I reminded Colin of my flawless 10-year track record and the millions of dollars in returns I had generated for the firm. I demanded a strict 72-hour grace period before any internal suspension was formally logged into the system. I promised to deliver a stamped police report, a sworn legal affidavit, and direct confirmation letters from the fraud departments of the issuing banks before the end of the business week. Colin hesitated, the silence stretching over the secure line. He knew the massive amount of money my current deal would bring to the partners. Finally, he agreed to the 72-hour window, but warned me that if I did not provide ironclad proof by Friday, I would be escorted out of the building by security. I hung up the phone, my jaw set in stone. My family had just put a ticking clock on my survival. I had exactly 3 days to tear their world apart before they ruined mine. I hung up the phone, my jaw set in stone. My family had just put a ticking clock on my survival. I had exactly 3 days to tear their world apart before they ruined mine. I closed the heavy hotel curtains, completely shutting out the bright San Francisco sunrise. I did not shed a single tear, and I absolutely refused to panic. Panic was the currency of the weak, and I operated in a corporate world built entirely on leverage and execution. I opened my encrypted contact list and dialed the private cell phone number of Oliver Kensington. Oliver was the managing partner of an elite corporate law firm in the financial district. He was a ruthless litigator who specialized in white-collar defense, high-net-worth asset protection, and corporate crisis management. He answered on the second ring. I told him I needed his entire crisis response team on a secure conference call in exactly 10 minutes. I did not give him the option to decline or ask questions. At exactly 6:30 in the morning, my isolated hotel suite transformed into a strategic war room. I sat at the mahogany desk with my laptop connected to a highly secure video link. On the screen were Oliver and Naomi, a former federal financial investigator who now ran the premier forensic accounting firm in Silicon Valley. I laid out the exact parameters of the catastrophe without a trace of emotion in my voice. I told them my personal identity had been hijacked to originate over $400,000 in fraudulent debt within the last 45 days. I explained that my multi-million-dollar property had been illegally locked down using an obsolete co-signer clause from 5 years ago. I stated clearly and firmly that the perpetrators were my own parents and my younger sister. I watched Oliver's expression harden into sheer professional focus. He did not offer useless sympathy or ask how I was feeling. He simply asked what my ultimate objective was. I told Oliver I wanted absolute scorched earth justice. I did not just want the debt cleared from my name. I wanted a bulletproof paper trail proving that my sister Melanie committed multiple counts of wire fraud, identity theft, and grand larceny. I wanted undeniable evidence that my father Harold utilized his banking expertise to orchestrate the bypass of standard financial security protocols. I needed sworn affidavits, federal police reports, and formal legal declarations delivered directly to the fraud departments of all 6 issuing banks before the end of the business week. Oliver immediately began drafting the emergency injunction to break the illegal lockout on my apartment. He noted that Harold's use of a 5-year-old document to declare a fake medical emergency to building management was a clear-cut case of filing a false instrument. He promised to have a superior court judge strike down the lockout order by tomorrow afternoon. I then turned my full attention to Naomi. I gave her firm, full legal authorization to access my compromised credit reports. I needed her team of digital forensic experts to track the exact digital footprint of every single fraudulent application. I knew Melanie was incredibly sloppy. She loved instant gratification and hated covering her tracks. I told Naomi to pull the internet protocol addresses associated with the online loan applications, fully expecting them to lead directly to my parents' sprawling Connecticut mansion. I instructed her to track the delivery address for the luxury sports car and the physical mailing addresses tied to the new platinum credit cards. I knew they would not be shipped to San Francisco. They would be routed straight to the East Coast, where Melanie could intercept them. Naomi typed furiously, the glowing code reflecting in her glasses. She informed me that tracing the application origins would take her team less than 24 hours. But I needed her to dig much deeper than that. The newly opened credit lines were just the symptom of a much larger disease. The real disease was the original $900,000 debt my father had violently demanded I pay. My family claimed Melanie had lost that massive fortune in cryptocurrency investments, but I knew my sister better than anyone. Melanie barely understood how to operate her mobile banking application, let alone navigate complex decentralized finance exchanges. She was a woman who spent her days buying designer handbags and taking staged photos at exclusive brunch spots. She did not lose nearly $1 million on the blockchain. I ordered Naomi to trace the exact origin of Melanie's massive financial deficit. I wanted to know exactly who she owed, where that money actually went, and who was actively covering for her. I wanted to see the hidden bank statements, the offshore wire transfers, and the secret accounts my parents were so desperately trying to protect. Naomi gave a sharp nod, her eyes alight with the thrill of the hunt. She warned me that digging into hidden family ledgers might uncover things I was not emotionally prepared to see. I looked directly into the camera lens and told her I was prepared to burn the entire family tree to the ground. I authorized an unlimited budget for the investigation. The pieces were rapidly moving into place. My elite legal and financial strike team was actively hunting down the indisputable evidence that would put my family behind bars. The pieces were rapidly moving into place. My elite legal and financial strike team was actively hunting down the indisputable evidence that would put my family behind bars. I closed my laptop and finally allowed myself to order room service. I needed black coffee and protein. I needed fuel. Just as the room service cart arrived at my hotel door, my personal cell phone began to vibrate on the nightstand. I picked it up and saw the screen flooded with notifications. It was the extended family group chat, a sprawling digital thread containing my parents, Melanie, aunts, uncles, and older cousins. I had muted this chat years ago, only checking it during holidays to maintain minimal polite contact. Now it was exploding with activity. The opening salvo came from my mother, Eleanor. She had uploaded a series of highly staged, dramatic photographs of Melanie. In the first image, Melanie was curled up on the bathroom floor, her makeup perfectly smeared, clutching a bottle of prescription sleeping pills. In the second image, she was staring blankly out a window, looking tragically gaunt and devastated. The caption beneath the photos read, "Please pray for Melanie. She is experiencing a severe mental health crisis. Her sister has completely abandoned her in her darkest hour of need, and we are terrified she might do something unthinkable." The manipulation was so blatant, so perfectly crafted for maximum emotional damage, that it almost took my breath away. Eleanor was not just playing the victim anymore. She was actively weaponizing Melanie's supposed fragility to turn the entire extended family into an attacking mob. She knew exactly what she was doing. She was attempting to publicly assassinate my character, branding me as a cold, heartless monster who was pushing her own sister towards suicide. The responses from the extended family poured in instantly, a relentless tidal wave of judgment and condemnation. My Aunt Margaret, a woman who had not spoken to me since I skipped her daughter's lavish parent-funded wedding to work on a crucial merger, was the first to attack. She typed in all capital letters, demanding to know how I could be so incredibly cruel. She accused me of letting my corporate success turn me into a sociopath. My Uncle Richard chimed in, stating that family always takes care of family, no matter the cost, and that my refusal to help Melanie was a disgusting display of pure greed. Cousin after cousin added their voices to the digital mob, calling me selfish, arrogant, and an absolute disgrace to the family name. Harold, my father, remained conspicuously silent in the chat. He was letting Eleanor orchestrate the emotional terrorism while he played the stoic, suffering patriarch in the background. They were using the combined weight of family guilt to try and crush my resolve. They expected me to break down, to publicly defend myself, to engage in a messy, emotional screaming match in front of everyone. They wanted me to look unhinged and defensive. I sat down in the plush hotel armchair, sipping my black coffee, and watched the notifications roll in. I felt a strange, detached calm wash over me. The old Sienna, the girl who had desperately craved their approval and worked 3 jobs just to prove her worth, might have crumbled under this massive, coordinated attack. She might have drafted long, pleading messages trying to explain her side of the story. She might have even considered liquidating the trust fund just to make the screaming stop. But that girl was gone. She died the moment Harold looked me in the eye and told me I was no longer his child. The woman sitting in the Four Seasons suite was a venture capital director who negotiated with ruthless billionaires for a living. I did not negotiate with emotional terrorists, and I certainly did not engage in public mudslinging with people who enabled federal crimes. I took deliberate, methodical screenshots of every single message in the chat. Every accusation, every staged photo of Melanie, every vicious comment from my aunts and uncles. I forwarded the entire batch directly to Oliver and Naomi. This was not just family drama anymore. It was documented evidence of coordinated harassment and character defamation actively designed to extort nearly $1 million from me. I did not type a single word in response. I did not defend myself. I did not point out that Melanie's tragic mental health crisis was actually just a panicked reaction to the consequences of committing massive financial fraud. I simply let them scream into the void. Their vitriol was a testament to their own toxic enablement, not a reflection of my character. They were furious because I had finally stopped playing my assigned role as the family scapegoat and financial safety net. I set my phone face down on the table, silencing the endless barrage of notifications. They could weaponize the group chat all they wanted. It would not change the fact that Naomi's team was rapidly closing in on the truth behind Melanie's massive debt. It would not change the fact that Oliver was preparing to legally dismantle Harold's illegal lockout. They were fighting a war of emotions while I was fighting a war of absolute facts. And in the real world outside of their country club echo chamber, facts always win. I finished my coffee, opened my laptop, and returned to work. The clock was ticking, and I had a fraud ring to expose. My encrypted messaging application pinged with a secure notification. I expected an update from Naomi regarding the offshore wire transfers, but the sender identification on my screen made me pause. It was a private message from Malik. I stared at his name. Malik was Melanie's husband, the brilliant African-American architect who had always seemed entirely out of place in my family's shallow, status-obsessed world. He was a self-made man who paid his way through a rigorous design program, pulling all-nighters to master structural integrity, while Melanie was maxing out our father's credit cards on designer shoes. I always respected Malik. He possessed a quiet, steadfast work ethic that starkly contrasted with my sister's relentless entitlement. In all the chaos of the past 48 hours, I had genuinely wondered how much he knew about the impending collapse of his household. The message was long, and the tone was completely devoid of the hysterical manipulation currently flooding the family group chat. Sienna Malik wrote, "I just saw the pictures your mother posted. I am currently out of state surveying a commercial build site, and I cannot get a straight answer out of anyone in Connecticut. Melanie is refusing my calls. Your father just told me you had a psychotic break and threatened the family, but I know you. You are the most rational person I have ever met. Please tell me what is actually going on. I am flying back tonight, and I need the truth before I walk into that house." I leaned back in the plush hotel chair, tapping my manicured nail against the desk. This was a critical juncture. Malik was legally bound to my sister, which made him a potential liability. If I shared confidential information, he could immediately relay it to Harold. However, Malik was also the only person in that entire social circle who valued actual hard work over maintaining appearances. If my parents were actively hiding a $900,000 debt from him, it meant his own financial future was in catastrophic danger. As a licensed architect, his professional bonding and insurance required strict financial stability. Melanie was not just destroying my credit. She was holding a lit match to his entire career. I decided to take a calculated risk. I picked up my phone and bypassed the text thread, entirely dialing his private number. He answered on the first ring, the ambient noise of a busy construction site echoing in the background. "Sienna," he said, his voice tight with exhaustion and anxiety. "Thank you for calling me back. What the hell happened yesterday?" I kept my voice steady and completely clinical. "Malik, I need you to step away from anyone who can overhear this conversation. What I am about to tell you is going to change your life, and you need to prepare yourself for the fallout." I heard the sound of heavy boots crunching on gravel as he walked away from his crew. The background noise faded into a tense silence. "I am alone," he said. "Tell me." "Tell." I did not soften the blow. I laid out the absolute facts. I told him that I was ambushed at my parents' estate under the false pretense of an anniversary dinner. I revealed that Melanie had amassed exactly $900,000 in secret aggressive debt. I explained that Harold and Eleanor had violently demanded I liquidate my grandfather's trust fund to pay it off, and when I refused, they officially disowned me. Then I delivered the final devastating strike. I told him about the identity theft. I explained that Melanie had stolen my social security number to open over $400,000 in fraudulent credit lines and that my corporate compliance officers were currently investigating me. The silence on the other end of the line was so profound, I thought the call had dropped. Finally, I heard a sharp, ragged intake of breath. Malik's voice cracked when he spoke. $900,000, Sienna. That is impossible. We live comfortably, but we do not have anywhere near that kind of liquidity. We share a joint checking account. I review our household expenses every single month. She has a strict allowance. She has been maintaining a shadow ledger, Malik, I stated firmly. The money you see is just the surface. She has been securing high-yield personal loans, hiding default notices, and opening credit cards in my name because she maxed out whatever secret accounts she already possessed. Your father-in-law knew about it, and he tried to extort me to cover her tracks before you found out. I heard a heavy thud like a man leaning his entire body weight against a concrete wall. Jesus, Malik whispered, the horror vibrating through the phone speaker. My architectural license, my firm. If we are carrying that kind of undocumented debt and she commits federal wire fraud. Sienna, I knew nothing about this. I swear to God I had absolutely no idea. I know you did not, I replied softly, dropping the corporate edge for just a fraction of a second. You are a good man, Malik. You work for what you have. That is why they kept you in the dark. They knew you would never tolerate this level of deception. I am so incredibly sorry, he said, his voice shaking, with a mixture of profound grief and rising anger. I am so sorry for what my wife has done to you, and I am disgusted by what your parents are doing right now in that group chat. I saw the staged photos. It is sick. It is completely sick. Malik took a deep, steadying breath, and when he spoke again, the grief was gone, replaced by a cold, hardened resolve that mirrored my own. I am going to the airport right now, he said. I am heading straight to Connecticut, but I am not going to their house. I am going to a hotel, and I am hiring a forensic auditor for my own accounts. I am not letting them drag me down with them. Do not tip your hand yet, I advised him sharply. My team is currently tracking exactly where that $900,000 went. Melanie did not lose it in cryptocurrency like she claims. I will have the final destination of those funds by tomorrow. Keep your head down, secure your personal assets, and wait for my signal. Understood? Malik replied, the partnership solidifying instantly. I am with you, Sienna. Whatever you need to burn this down, you have it. I ended the call feeling a sharp surge of adrenaline. Harold and Eleanor thought they had successfully isolated me by weaponizing the extended family. They had no idea I had just flipped their most valuable player. Malik was inside their fortress and he was ready to help me open the gates. Harold and Eleanor thought they had successfully isolated me by weaponizing the extended family. They had no idea I had just flipped their most valuable player. Malik was inside their fortress and he was ready to help me open the gates. I set my phone flat on the mahogany desk and watched the screen light up with a fresh wave of notifications. The family group chat was still a chaotic frenzy of emotional manipulation. My mother had just uploaded another dramatic paragraph about how my selfishness was tearing her heart into pieces. My uncle chimed in with a lengthy rant about respect and traditional family values. They were feeding off each other, building a towering echo chamber of manufactured outrage. They felt incredibly powerful in their little digital arena. It was time to introduce them to the real world. I opened the messaging application and tapped on the text box. I did not draft a defensive essay or attempt to explain my side of the story to a captive audience of flying monkeys. I did not use exclamation points or emotional language. I channeled the absolute freezing authority I used when dismantling hostile takeovers in Silicon Valley boardrooms. I typed out a single precise message designed to shatter their manufactured reality. I wrote, I am addressing Harold, Eleanor, and Melanie directly. I am fully aware of the $400,000 in fraudulent credit accounts opened using my stolen identity. I am also fully aware of the illegal manipulation of my property deed used to lock me out of my San Francisco apartment this morning. This is not a family dispute. These are multiple federal felonies, including wire fraud, identity theft, and extortion. You have exactly 3 days to return my apartment and clear the fraudulent debt from my name. If you do not comply by Friday at noon, I will hand over all forensic evidence to the federal authorities and the fraud departments of the issuing banks. I will not hesitate to prosecute. The clock starts now. I read the message once to ensure every word was legally sound, then pressed send. The impact was instantaneous. The typing indicator bubbles from 2 of my aunts, which had been bouncing energetically at the bottom of the screen, vanished. The relentless stream of notifications flatlined. Absolute, terrified digital silence descended on the group chat. The extended family members who had been so eager to attack me over a perceived lack of sisterly compassion suddenly realized they had stepped into the middle of a massive criminal conspiracy. No one wants to be caught on the record supporting grand larceny and identity theft. The flying monkeys scattered back into the shadows, leaving my parents and my sister entirely exposed. I waited, my eyes locked on the screen, watching the read receipts appear one by one. 2 minutes passed, then 3. I knew exactly what was happening in that Connecticut mansion. Panic was setting in. Melanie was likely hyperventilating for real this time, realizing her sloppy financial crimes had been fully uncovered. My mother was probably pacing the floor, terrified of the public scandal. But Harold, the arrogant former bank manager who believed he was the smartest man in any room, would never back down from a direct challenge. The typing bubble reappeared. It was Harold. He did not attempt to deny the allegations. His narcissism simply would not allow him to retreat or apologize. Instead, he chose to double down, cementing his own guilt in writing. His reply popped up on the screen, a long block of text dripping with condescension and mockery. He wrote, "You are making a hysterical fool of yourself. You are clearly having a psychological breakdown, which is exactly why I exercised my legal right as a co-signer to secure your apartment for your own safety. As for your sister, she made some unfortunate administrative errors with joint family accounts, but it is nothing we cannot handle internally. You are bluffing. You would never drag your own mother and sister into a federal courtroom. You do not have the stomach to send your family to prison. Stop this embarrassing tantrum, liquidate the trust fund to clear the balance, and maybe I will consider giving you the new passcode to your apartment." I read his response, a cold smile spreading across my face. He actually thought I was bluffing. He believed the old conditioning, the years of demanding his approval, would override my sense of self-preservation. He was so blinded by his own authority that he just confessed to the illegal lockout and acknowledged Melanie's financial crimes in a group chat with over 20 witnesses. He thought his status as a patriarch made him bulletproof. I did not reply to his mockery. I simply took a high-resolution screenshot of his message capturing the timestamp and his explicit admission of extortion. I forwarded the image directly to Oliver, my corporate attorney, with a brief note attached. I told Oliver we now had the father's written confession to the lockout and his acknowledgement of the fraudulent debt. I locked my phone and stood up from the desk. Harold had made his choice. He had proudly rejected the only exit ramp I was ever going to offer him. The 3-day countdown had officially begun, and my family was completely oblivious to the absolute destruction heading their way. I did not sleep that night. The glow of my laptop screen was the only light in the hotel suite, as I waited for Naomi and her team to tear through the financial firewall my sister had attempted to build. At exactly 8 in the morning, a secure video link popped up on my screen. Naomi was sitting in her office looking energized, despite having pulled an all-nighter. She did not bother with a greeting. She simply shared her screen and told me to brace myself. Naomi explained that the entire narrative about Melanie losing $900,000 in cryptocurrency was a complete and utter fabrication. My sister had indeed opened accounts on two major crypto exchanges, but those accounts were entirely dormant. They were dummy accounts, set up purely as a smokescreen to show our father a few fake charts when he asked where the money went. Melanie did not know the first thing about blockchain technology, and she certainly did not possess the technical intellect to execute a decentralized digital heist. I watched as Naomi pulled up a complex web of wire transfers and routing numbers. She tracked the funds from my stolen credit lines and the original missing $900,000. Instead of going into volatile tech investments, the money had been systematically washed through a series of poorly constructed shell companies registered in Delaware. From there, the funds were wired directly to an offshore banking institution in the Cayman Islands. I leaned closer to the screen, my eyes narrowing at the financial spiderweb. I asked Naomi why a suburban housewife from Connecticut would need a Cayman Islands account. Naomi smiled a sharp, predatory look. She explained that the offshore account was not the final destination. It was just a clearinghouse to obscure the trail. The money was sitting offshore for exactly 48 hours before being wired directly back into the United States. Naomi clicked a button, and a new document filled the screen. It was a commercial residential lease agreement for a massive, ultra-luxury penthouse apartment located in the heart of Soho, New York City. The monthly rent was an astronomical $25,000. The lease was paid in full a year in advance, using a wire transfer originating directly from the Cayman Islands account. I asked who was listed on the lease. It certainly was not Malik, and it was not Melanie. Naomi pulled up a digital profile. A high-resolution photograph of a man in his early 20s appeared on my screen. He had chiseled features, expensive styled hair, and the distinct polished look of an aspiring Instagram model. His name was Chase. According to his digital footprint, he was a self-proclaimed lifestyle influencer and personal trainer living his absolute best life in Manhattan. Naomi did not stop there. She cross-referenced the dates of the massive cash withdrawals from my fraudulently opened credit cards with Chase's social media posts. The correlation was sickeningly precise. On the exact day, a $50,000 cash advance was pulled from my stolen platinum card. Chase posted a picture of a brand new custom Rolex watch with a caption thanking his generous private investor. When a $100,000 signature loan was approved in my name, Chase suddenly posted a video touring his new Soho penthouse, bragging about his real estate success. Melanie was not a victim of a bad investment. She was a sugar mama. She was actively financing the extravagant lifestyle of a 20-something aspiring model in New York City. The missing $900,000, which my father claimed was a tragic family emergency that required me to sacrifice my grandfather's trust fund, was paying for Chase's designer clothes, luxury vacations, and Manhattan rent. When Melanie ran out of her own money, and when she drained whatever secret funds she had access to, she did not stop. She simply stole my identity to keep the cash flowing to her secret lover. I sat back in my chair, the sheer magnitude of the betrayal washing over me. This went so far beyond financial irresponsibility. This was a calculated, devastating double life. While Malik was working grueling hours managing architectural builds to provide a beautiful home for his wife, Melanie, was funneling their resources and my stolen credit into another man's pocket. The realization hit me with the force of a freight train. Harold had to know. My father was a former bank manager. He was meticulous about tracking finances. There was absolutely no way he looked at the routing numbers on Melanie's debt and genuinely believed it went into a digital wallet. He knew his golden child was funding a secret affair in New York City. He knew the shame and the scandal it would bring to their pristine country club reputation if Malik found out and filed for a highly publicized divorce. Harold was not just trying to save Melanie from debt. He was trying to extort me to cover up her infidelity and preserve the family image. I asked Naomi to dig deeper into the physical evidence. I needed absolute, undeniable proof of the physical affair, not just the financial link. Naomi nodded and pulled up a series of credit card receipts linked to a high-end boutique hotel in Manhattan. The hotel was located exactly 3 blocks from Chase's penthouse. The room was booked under Melanie's maiden name, but the incidentals, the expensive room service, the couple's spa treatments, and the luxury car service were paid for using the fraudulent credit card opened with my social security number. Naomi had even managed to pull the public security camera footage from the street corner outside the hotel, accessing it through a private security network contact she maintained. She played a short, grainy video clip. It showed Melanie wearing a designer trench coat, stepping out of a black town car and throwing her arms around Chase. They kissed passionately right there on the New York pavement before walking into the hotel lobby together. The timestamp on the video was from exactly 2 weeks ago, a Tuesday afternoon, when she was supposedly attending a charity luncheon in Connecticut. I stared at the paused video frame of my sister kissing another man, financed by my stolen identity. The rage I felt was no longer hot and explosive. It was absolute freezing, absolute zero. I instructed Naomi to compile every single piece of this evidence into a master dossier. I wanted the wire transfer logs, the Cayman Island routing numbers, the Soho lease agreement, the matching social media timestamps, and the security footage, all bound into one indisputable, devastating package. Naomi confirmed the dossier would be ready and securely encrypted within the hour. She asked what my next move was. I told her that I was going to use this dossier to completely dismantle the false reality my family had built. But first, I had to secure my most important ally. I had to show this file to Malik. The betrayal against me was financial and professional, but the betrayal against Malik was entirely personal. He was a good man, tied to a toxic parasite, and he deserved to see the absolute truth before the federal authorities blew his life apart. I thanked Naomi for her flawless execution and ended the video call. I picked up my secure phone and dialed Malik's number. He answered quickly, his voice low and tense. He told me he had checked into a hotel near the airport, refusing to go back to the Connecticut house until he understood the full scope of the disaster. I told him I had the answers. I told him the $900,000 debt was not a crypto loss, and that the financial hole was much darker than he could ever imagine. I instructed him to stay exactly where he was. I was booking the next available first-class flight back to the East Coast. I was coming to hand-deliver the evidence myself. I packed my overnight bag with mechanical precision. I was no longer a victim scrambling to protect my career. I was an executioner armed with the exact coordinates of my enemy's weakest point. My father wanted to play a game of leverage. He wanted to use my apartment as a hostage to protect his golden child. He had no idea that I was about to drop a nuclear bomb on his entire legacy. I walked out of the Four Seasons suite heading straight for the airport. I bypassed the chaotic commercial terminals at San Francisco International and directed my driver straight to the private aviation hangars. My venture capital firm maintained a fractional ownership in a fleet of corporate jets for critical executive travel. A coordinated federal fraud ring targeting a managing director certainly qualified as a corporate crisis. I boarded the sleek Gulfstream, ordered the flight attendant to hold all service, and connected my encrypted laptop to the high-speed satellite network before the wheels even left the tarmac. Halfway across the country, a secure notification flashed across my screen. Naomi had not stopped digging. She knew that a massive financial hemorrhage like Melanie's did not occur in a vacuum. A 28-year-old woman with no steady income could not maintain a shadow life in Manhattan, pay $25,000 a month for a luxury penthouse, and successfully originate massive credit lines without a highly sophisticated safety net. Naomi had legally subpoenaed the metadata from the family cell phone plan. Melanie, in her infinite arrogance and stupidity, had never unlinked her personal devices from our parents' shared cloud account. Naomi's digital forensics team had successfully extracted the archived text messages, deleted photographs, and private email threads between my sister, my mother, and my father spanning the last 8 months. I opened the master file, bracing myself for the usual toxic family dynamics. What I found was a meticulously documented, terrifying criminal conspiracy. Harold and Eleanor did not just accidentally discover Melanie's massive debt and panic. They actively managed it, funded it, and eventually conspired to transfer the entire financial burden directly onto my shoulders. I began reading a lengthy email thread dated exactly 6 months ago. Harold had caught a discrepancy in a bank statement and discovered the offshore wire transfers. He confronted Melanie, who immediately broke down and confessed to the affair with Chase. She admitted that she had entirely drained the joint savings account she shared with Malik to pay for the Soho penthouse and fund her lover's extravagant lifestyle. Instead of telling Malik the truth, my father chose to protect his own pristine social standing. Harold was currently campaigning heavily for the position of board president at their elite Connecticut country club. It was a highly coveted social crown he had aggressively chased for over a decade. Malik, as a highly respected and successful architect, had recently designed the spectacular new pavilion for that very same club. Malik's sterling professional reputation and his presence in the family was a massive asset to my father's campaign. If Malik discovered his wife was a cheating fraudster who had secretly bankrupted their household, the resulting high-profile divorce would absolutely destroy my family's image. Harold would become a laughingstock, a social pariah, and the presidency would immediately go to his rival. To prevent the scandal from leaking, Harold quietly liquidated a significant portion of his own retirement portfolio. He used his own money to temporarily refill Malik and Melanie's joint accounts before Malik ever noticed the missing funds. He bought Melanie time, instructing her to quietly end the affair and sell off her designer assets to pay him back. But Chase's lifestyle was a bottomless pit, and my father's liquid cash quickly dried up. When the money stopped flowing, Chase threatened to expose the affair to Malik himself. That was when the family narrative shifted from containment to active extortion. I opened a text thread between my mother and Melanie from just 4 weeks ago. Eleanor wrote, "Your sister makes millions playing with computer money in California. She does not even have a husband or children to support. It is deeply selfish of her to hoard that wealth while you are suffering. Your father is figuring out a way to make her pay her fair share. We just need to apply the right pressure." The sheer malice in those words took my breath away. They were actively rationalizing my destruction. They convinced themselves that because I chose a demanding corporate career over a traditional suburban marriage, I was somehow less deserving of the money I had earned. They viewed me as a malfunctioning financial asset that needed to be forcibly liquidated for the greater good of the family image. The most sickening piece of evidence was an email Harold sent to his personal attorney, attempting to find a legal loophole to forcibly seize my grandfather's trust fund. When the attorney informed him the trust was ironclad and completely inaccessible without my signature, Harold pivoted directly to identity theft. He explicitly coached Melanie on how to bypass the security questions on the credit applications. He provided her with my exact social security number from his fireproof home safe. He even suggested which boutique lending firms to target, utilizing his insider banking knowledge to exploit institutions whose verification processes were notoriously lax. His ultimate exit strategy was laid out in a chilling message to Eleanor. He wrote, "If the federal authorities flag the new debt, we will simply claim Sienna was managing Melanie's money through her venture capital firm and lost it in high-risk tech investments. It will be her word against ours, and no one will believe a wealthy, ruthless executive over her weeping younger sister. We will say Sienna stole the money to cover her own bad bets." I stared at the screen as the jet hit a pocket of turbulence, my hands completely steady. They were not just going to drain my bank accounts. They were actively plotting to frame me for embezzlement. They planned to offer me up as the perfect corporate scapegoat to federal investigators, so Melanie could walk away completely untouched and Harold could secure his country club presidency. The level of sociopathic calculation was staggering. They had weaponized my entire existence to serve their needs. I carefully closed the files and forwarded the entire unredacted dossier to Oliver. We now had undeniable proof of premeditated fraud, criminal conspiracy, and intent to frame a corporate officer. The narrative my parents had carefully constructed was nothing more than a fragile house of cards built on lies and stolen money. As the plane began its descent toward the East Coast, I looked out the window at the sprawling cities below. I felt a profound, absolute calm wash over me. The confusion, the hurt, and the lingering questions about why my family could never simply love me were entirely gone. They were replaced by a singular, razor-sharp focus. I had the weapon I needed, and I was exactly 1 hour away from handing it directly to the man whose life they had ruined just as thoroughly as mine. I was going to meet Malik, and together we were going to end this. The black corporate car pulled up to an unremarkable business hotel just 3 miles from the regional airport. I instructed the driver to wait and made my way through the poorly lit lobby. I bypassed the front desk completely and headed straight for the fourth floor. I knocked twice on room 412. The door opened immediately. Malik stood in the doorway, and the sight of him made my chest tighten. He was a man who usually took immense pride in his appearance, always impeccably dressed in tailored suits or crisp architectural drafting shirts. Today he wore a wrinkled gray hoodie and jeans. His eyes were bloodshot, surrounded by deep dark circles that spoke of a completely sleepless night. He looked like a man who had just watched his entire world burn to the ground and was still choking on the smoke. He stepped aside without a word, allowing me to enter the standard sterile hotel room. I walked over to the small circular table near the window and set down my leather briefcase. I did not offer any empty platitudes or fake sympathy. Malik was a professional who built skyscrapers from the ground up. He understood that when a foundation is compromised, you do not paint over the cracks, you demolish the structure. I opened my laptop, entered my decryption keys, and pulled up the master dossier Naomi had compiled. I turned the screen to face him. I told him to sit down. I told him that what he was about to see would be the most painful experience of his life, but it was the absolute truth. Malik pulled up a chair. He stared at the screen as I walked him through the digital autopsy of his marriage. I showed him the dormant cryptocurrency accounts Melanie had used as a decoy. I showed him the offshore wire transfers routing through the Cayman Islands. Then I opened the commercial residential lease agreement for the Soho penthouse. I watched his eyes scan the $25,000 monthly rental fee. I watched his jaw clench when he saw the lease was paid a full year in advance, using funds directly siphoned from his own joint savings account and my stolen credit lines. Then I brought up the photographs. I showed him the high-resolution images of Chase. I read aloud the social media timestamps that perfectly aligned with the massive cash advances Melanie had fraudulently originated in my name. Finally, I played the security camera footage from the Manhattan boutique hotel. Malik sat completely frozen as he watched his wife, the woman he had promised to build a life with, step out of a luxury town car and passionately kiss a 20-something influencer on a New York sidewalk. The video looped silently on the screen. The only sound in the room was the harsh, ragged sound of Malik breathing. He did not yell. He did not throw anything. He simply placed his hands flat on the table, his knuckles turning white from the pressure. He stared at the paused frame of Melanie's face. When he finally spoke, his voice was an eerie, hollow whisper. He said he had spent the last 2 years working 80-hour weeks. He said he took on high-stress commercial commissions managing massive construction crews just so Melanie could live the comfortable suburban life she demanded. He thought her constant shopping and spa trips were just the harmless habits of a spoiled woman. He had absolutely no idea he was actively funding a secret double life. He had no idea his father-in-law was using his pristine architectural reputation to secure a country club presidency while actively covering up his wife's infidelity. I closed the laptop. I told him Harold and Eleanor were currently preparing to frame me for the entire financial disaster to keep him in the dark. I told him they viewed him as nothing more than a highly respectable prop for their family photos. Malik looked up at me, his dark eyes hardening into pure, unadulterated steel. The grief was instantly overwritten by a cold, calculating fury. He leaned back in his chair and wiped a hand across his exhausted face. He told me that Harold made a fatal logistical error when he initiated his emergency lockdown. Harold was so focused on weaponizing the extended family in the group chat and securing his country club campaign that he forgot who had the spare security codes to his Connecticut mansion. Malik stood up, walked over to the hotel bed, and picked up a heavy reinforced canvas duffel bag. He dropped it onto the table next to my laptop. The bag landed with a heavy metallic thud. He looked at me with a grim, humorless smile. He explained that when I called him yesterday and warned him to secure his personal assets, he did not just go to the bank. He knew that if his architectural firm caught wind of a massive, unverified debt, he would lose his licensing bonds and his entire career. He needed hard physical proof that he was a victim of financial fraud, not a co-conspirator. So before driving to the airport hotel, Malik drove straight to my parents' estate. He knew Harold and Eleanor were out attending a charity committee luncheon. He used his family passcode to bypass the estate security system. He walked directly into Harold's private home office. Malik told me that Harold was an arrogant man who believed his home was an impenetrable fortress. Harold did not bother encrypting his physical files because he thought he was untouchable. Malik unzipped the heavy canvas duffel bag. Inside were dozens of thick physical ledger books, bound financial folders, and a highly secure external hard drive he had yanked directly from Harold's desktop computer. Malik had systematically stripped the office of every single sensitive financial document he could find. He took the offshore routing slips. He took the country club bribery records. He took the physical copies of Melanie's fraudulent loan applications that Harold had meticulously corrected with red pen. Malik pushed the open duffel bag across the table toward me. He said he had already made digital copies of everything he needed to present to his own divorce attorneys and the State Architectural Licensing Board to prove his absolute innocence. The rest of it belonged to me. He told me that Harold's entire life was in that bag. I stared at the treasure trove of physical evidence. Naomi's digital forensics were brilliant, but having Harold's actual handwritten notes and raw physical ledgers was the equivalent of holding a loaded weapon to the patriarch's head. It was the undeniable physical proof of a coordinated federal crime. I looked at Malik, a profound sense of mutual respect passing between us. We were the only two people who had actually worked for our success, and we were the only two people they had attempted to destroy. I told him I was going to end their reign of terror by the end of the week. I told him to have his divorce papers drafted and ready. Malik nodded sharply. He said he was going to walk into the country club gala on Friday night, hand Melanie the papers, and walk out a free man. I pulled the duffel bag toward me, my mind racing with the possibilities. I told Malik I had one more thing to find before I executed my final strike. I needed to see exactly what Harold was hiding in his personal safe regarding my grandfather's estate. I reached into the bag and began pulling out the heavy folders. I pulled the heavy folders from the canvas bag one by one, stacking them on the hotel room table. Malik watched me for a moment, his posture rigid but remarkably lighter than when he first arrived. We did not need to exchange any emotional goodbyes or dramatic promises. We had a timeline to execute. He gave me a single firm nod, picked up his car keys, and walked out the door to call his divorce attorney. The lock clicked shut, leaving me entirely alone with the physical manifestation of my father's criminal empire. I sat down at the table, cracked my knuckles, and went to work. The sheer volume of Harold's arrogance was staggering. He had kept physical handwritten ledgers of his embezzlement. I found the red-penned drafts of Melanie's fraudulent loan applications, complete with my forged signature practiced repeatedly in the margins. I found the routing slips for the Cayman Island accounts. But I pushed those aside. Naomi already had the digital footprint for the fraud. I was hunting for the root cause of Harold's desperation. I wanted the trust fund documents. My grandfather, a man who actually built his fortune through grueling industrial work, had always seen right through my father's country club pretensions. When he died a decade ago, Harold had swooped in as the executor, handing me a heavily redacted summary of the trust. Harold claimed the $3 million was locked behind complex age milestones, and that the principal could only be accessed with his direct parental authorization. I had been too young and too focused on surviving my own student debt to hire an independent lawyer to challenge him. That was the exact vulnerability Harold had relied upon. At the very bottom of the duffel bag, buried beneath a stack of golf club membership renewals, I found a thick sealed envelope made of heavy watermarked legal paper. The seal had been broken long ago, but the documents inside were pristine. The header read, "Last Will and Testament and Irrevocable Trust Declaration." I carefully unfolded the thick pages, running my fingers over the embossed notary stamps. This was not the summarized, redacted version my father had paraded in front of me for years. This was the original unedited master document. I skipped past the standard distribution clauses and zeroed in on the primary asset schedules. My eyes scanned the dense legal jargon, tracking line by line through my grandfather's final directives. Suddenly, my breath caught in my throat. I stopped reading, blinked hard, and read the entire paragraph a second time, then a third. A cold, razor-sharp thrill shot straight down my spine. My grandfather had not just left me $3 million in liquid capital. He had placed the sprawling multi-million-dollar Connecticut estate, the exact mansion my parents currently occupied, into the irrevocable trust. According to the explicit terms of the original deed transfer, Harold and Eleanor never actually owned the property. They were granted a strict conditional right of residency. They were legally designated as temporary custodians of the estate, permitted to live there only until the primary beneficiary reached their 30th birthday. Upon my 30th birthday, the deed was to be automatically and fully transferred into my sole name, giving me absolute authority to liquidate, occupy, or lease the property. I am 32 years old. I sat back in the chair, the massive weight of the deception crashing over me. Harold and Eleanor had been living in my house illegally for the last 2 years. They had been hosting their lavish anniversary dinners, throwing their country club cocktail parties, and housing their golden child Melanie under a roof that legally belonged entirely to me. The pieces of the puzzle slammed together with sickening clarity. Harold's violent, unhinged demand for $900,000 was not just about saving Melanie from her secret lover's debt. It was a desperate, multi-layered cover-up. If my credit was destroyed and I was fired from my venture capital firm, I would be forced to crawl back to Connecticut and beg for his help. If he maintained absolute control over my life, I would never hire the independent lawyers required to audit the trust fund. He needed to break me professionally and financially before I ever realized he was squatting in my mansion. He locked me out of my San Francisco apartment because he was terrified I was about to kick him out of his own home. I picked up my secure phone and immediately dialed Oliver. The sun was fully up now, casting bright, harsh light across the hotel room. Oliver answered with his usual crisp efficiency. I did not waste time with pleasantries. I told him to pull the municipal property records for my parents' Connecticut address immediately. I told him to cross-reference the deed with the original trust documents I was securely scanning over to him right now. I heard the rapid clicking of a keyboard on Oliver's end. A minute later, a low, impressed whistle came through the speaker. He confirmed it. The title was held in the trust's name, and the custodial period had officially expired 24 months ago. Harold had been actively hiding the deed transfer notices from the county clerk. I instructed Oliver to draft an immediate non-negotiable 30-day notice to vacate the premises. I wanted the eviction papers printed on the heaviest, most expensive legal stock his firm possessed. I told him to have his most intimidating process server standing by. I was not going to mail the eviction notice. I was not going to send it via email. I was going to walk into the country club charity gala on Friday night, step right up to the head table, and hand the eviction notice directly to my father in front of every single wealthy socialite he had spent his entire pathetic life trying to impress. Harold wanted to play games with real estate. He was about to learn that in the world of venture capital, the house always wins. I stood across the street from the Oakwood Country Club, watching the valet line stretch down the manicured driveway. This was Harold's crowning moment, the annual spring charity gala, an event he had meticulously engineered to secure his position as board president. I adjusted the lapels of my tailored black suit. I wasn't wearing a gown. I was dressed for a corporate execution. Inside the ballroom was a sea of glittering chandeliers, clinking champagne glasses, and Connecticut's most aggressively polite socialites. I slipped past the registration desk, my name conspicuously absent from the guest list, and navigated the familiar perimeter. I knew this club. I knew the layout. I knew exactly where Harold would be waiting before his grand speech. The backstage staging area was separated from the main ballroom by heavy velvet curtains. I pushed through the fabric and found him. Harold was standing by a mirrored pillar adjusting his bow tie. He looked perfectly composed, a man who believed his entire world was completely under his control. He caught my reflection in the mirror. He didn't flinch. He didn't look surprised. He turned around, an arrogant, self-satisfied smile playing on his lips. "I knew you'd come," Harold said, his voice dropping to a low, conspiratorial murmur. "You always were practical, Sienna. You understand leverage." He reached into his tuxedo jacket and pulled out a folded document. He didn't offer a greeting. He didn't ask how I got into the building. He just held the paper out, expecting me to take it. "This is a standard debt transfer agreement," Harold stated, his tone dripping with corporate condescension. "It legally shifts Melanie's entire outstanding balance, all $900,000, directly into your name. You assume full liability. You clear her accounts." I stared at the paper, then back at him. I didn't move. "And in return," I asked, my voice dangerously flat. Harold smirked. "In return, I authorize the building management in San Francisco to reset your apartment passcode. You get your life back, Sienna. You get to keep your fancy job and your pristine credit score. All you have to do is sign." He pulled a silver fountain pen from his pocket and offered it to me. He genuinely believed he had won. He thought the threat of losing my career had broken me. He viewed me as a defeated opponent ready to accept terms of surrender. "You orchestrated a coordinated federal identity theft ring," I said, my voice steady. "You locked me out of my own home using a 5-year-old loophole. And you did it all to protect Melanie's secret affair in New York City." Harold's smile vanished. His eyes darted toward the heavy velvet curtains, checking to ensure we were alone. "Keep your voice down," he hissed, the facade of the benevolent patriarch crumbling instantly. "You don't know what you're talking about." "I know she's paying $25,000 a month for a Soho penthouse," I continued, stepping closer. "I know she wired the money through the Cayman Islands. I know you liquidated your own retirement accounts to cover the initial shortage before Malik noticed. I know everything, Harold." His face paled, the arrogant certainty replaced by a sudden, sharp panic. He realized I wasn't there to surrender. I was there with an arsenal. "You sign this paper right now," Harold demanded, his voice trembling with suppressed rage. "You sign it, or I swear to God, I will call my contacts at your firm tomorrow morning. I will personally ensure you are investigated for financial misconduct." "You're going to frame me for embezzlement," I stated, confirming the final piece of his plan. "You're going to tell the federal authorities that I stole the money to cover bad tech investments." Harold sneered, regaining a fraction of his confidence. "It's my word against yours. Who are they going to believe, a respected bank manager and pillar of this community, or a desperate estranged daughter trying to hide her failures?" He thrust the pen toward me again. "Sign it, Sienna. It's the only way out." I didn't take the pen. I didn't look at the contract. I looked Harold straight in the eye and delivered the first calculated strike. "Malik knows," I said. Harold froze. The pen hovered in the air between us. "I showed Malik the offshore transfers." I continued, my voice absolute ice. "I showed him the lease agreement. I showed him the security footage of Melanie kissing her 20-something influencer outside a Manhattan hotel." Harold stumbled back a step, the color draining entirely from his face. The country club presidency, his entire social standing relied on Malik's pristine reputation. I had just detonated the foundation of his campaign. "And," I added, delivering the killing blow, "Malik went into your home office. He took your physical ledgers. He took the red-penned loan applications. We have every single piece of evidence, Harold." The silence in the backstage area was profound. The muffled sounds of the gala outside felt a million miles away. Harold stared at me, his chest heaving, the realization of his absolute destruction crashing over him. He was trapped. He was exposed. Before he could formulate a response, the stage manager poked his head through the curtain. "Mr. Vance, we're ready for you on stage." Harold looked at the stage manager, then back at me, pure terror in his eyes. "Go ahead, Harold," I said, stepping aside and gesturing toward the stage. "Your audience is waiting." "Go ahead, Harold," I said, stepping aside and gesturing toward the stage. "Your audience is waiting." Harold remained entirely paralyzed. The slick, confident patriarch who had spent his life dominating boardrooms and intimidating his family was suddenly reduced to a trembling statue. His grip on the fraudulent debt contract loosened the paper crinkling slightly in his sweaty palm. He opened his mouth to speak, but no sound came out. The sheer weight of his impending destruction had crushed the air right out of his lungs. The stage manager looked back and forth between us, his brow furrowed in deep confusion. He checked his clipboard, whispering that the introductory music was already playing. Harold did not blink. He was trapped in a nightmare of his own making, realizing every exit door had been barricaded. I did not wait for him to find his voice. I stepped smoothly around my petrified father, brushed past the confused stage manager, and walked directly through the heavy velvet curtains. The blinding heat of the stage spotlight hit my face instantly. The grand ballroom of the Oakwood Country Club was packed to absolute capacity. Hundreds of Connecticut's most elite socialites, wealthy investors, and local politicians sat at circular tables draped in white silk. The gentle clinking of crystal champagne flutes and polite laughter echoed across the massive room. This was the pinnacle of high society, the exact demographic my parents worshipped above all else. As I walked purposefully toward the central podium, a ripple of surprised murmurs washed over the crowd. I was not the man they were expecting. I scanned the front row and immediately locked eyes with my mother. Eleanor was seated at the VIP table, wearing a dazzling emerald gown. Next to her sat Melanie, adorned in diamonds, purchased with my stolen credit lines. Eleanor's practiced smile completely froze. Her posture stiffened. She leaned over and whispered frantically to Melanie. Melanie dropped her silver dessert fork, her eyes widening in sheer panic. For a fleeting second, I saw raw terror in their expressions. But then as quickly as the panic appeared, it vanished. Eleanor smoothed her gown and sat up perfectly straight, her confident smirk returning. I knew exactly what my mother was thinking. She assumed Harold had won. She assumed her husband had successfully cornered me backstage, broken my spirit, and forced me to sign the massive debt transfer agreement. In her delusional mind, my appearance on stage meant I was there to play the role of the dutiful, deeply apologetic daughter. She genuinely believed I was about to deliver a glowing endorsement of my father's character to buy my way back into their good graces. I reached the wooden podium and grasped the edges with both hands. I leaned into the microphone. The feedback whined for a fraction of a second, demanding the absolute attention of every single person in the ballroom. The idle chatter died instantly. I welcomed the esteemed guests. I kept my voice perfectly modulated, projecting the polished, authoritative tone I utilized during high-stakes venture capital pitches in Silicon Valley. I thanked them all for gathering to celebrate the principles of leadership integrity and community trust. I told the audience that my father was a man who believed strongly in the preservation of family legacy. I stated that he was a former banking executive who understood the intricate mechanics of financial leverage better than anyone. I praised his relentless dedication to maintaining appearances, noting that he would go to absolutely any length and utilize any loophole to ensure his pristine image remained completely untarnished. A polite, appreciative applause broke out among the back tables. The wealthy attendees nodded along, raising their glasses. They were entirely captivated by the narrative of a loving daughter praising her successful father. Eleanor visibly relaxed, taking a confident sip of her champagne. She thought the war was over. I let the applause die down completely. I reached into the inside pocket of my tailored black suit jacket and pulled out my secure mobile device. I connected the phone directly to the podium's digital presentation dock, syncing it effortlessly to the massive projector screen hanging directly behind me. I leaned back into the microphone and announced that true leadership requires absolute transparency. I stated that before they cast their votes for their new board president, it was my distinct honor to present a comprehensive look into the reality of Harold's financial legacy. I tapped the screen of my mobile device. The massive projector behind me flared to life, illuminating the dark stage with a brilliant, stark white light. But the image that appeared was not a heartwarming montage of family vacations or carefully staged holiday portraits. It was a sprawling, highly detailed forensic accounting flowchart created by the best financial investigators in Silicon Valley. The crowd went completely silent. The polite smiles on the faces of the country club elite faltered, replaced by a wave of profound confusion. I gripped the edges of the wooden podium and spoke directly into the microphone with absolute clarity. I told the audience that a true leader must possess unshakable financial integrity and a commitment to radical transparency. I pointed to the glowing screen behind me and directed their attention to the first cluster of data. I explained that what they were looking at was a meticulously documented trail of federal wire fraud, grand larceny, and identity theft. I stated that over the past 45 days, exactly $400,000 in fraudulent high-yield credit lines had been illegally opened using my stolen Social Security number. A collective gasp rippled through the front rows. Women in expensive gowns exchanged horrified glances. Men in tailored tuxedos sat up completely straight, their eyes locked on the undeniable bank logos and redacted federal documents displayed on the screen. I did not pause to let them process the shock. I looked directly at Melanie, who had gone as pale as a ghost, her hands gripping the edge of the silk tablecloth so tightly her knuckles were stark white. I told the room that the person responsible for this massive federal crime was not a shadowy cybercriminal operating halfway across the world. I stated clearly that the perpetrator was the woman sitting right in front of them at the VIP table, wearing a diamond necklace purchased with my stolen platinum card. I shifted my gaze to the velvet curtains where Harold was still hiding backstage. I announced to the room that a crime of this specific magnitude required sophisticated banking knowledge to bypass standard financial security protocols. I pressed another button on my phone. The massive screen shifted to display high-resolution scans of Harold's handwritten notes showing the exact loan applications he had corrected and modified with his signature red pen. I told the horrified audience that the man they were about to elect as their board president had actively coached his youngest daughter on how to commit federal identity theft against his oldest daughter. I explained that Harold had deliberately locked me out of my San Francisco apartment just 48 hours ago, utilizing a 5-year-old obsolete legal loophole, attempting to extort me into liquidating my grandfather's trust fund to cover up this massive felony. The silence in the ballroom was now entirely suffocating. You could hear a pin drop in the massive space. Eleanor was gripping her chest, her emerald gown suddenly looking like a prison uniform. She opened her mouth to scream, but the sheer shock of the public exposure kept her completely paralyzed. I did not give her a single second to interrupt or spin a false narrative. I tapped my screen again. A new web of banking routing numbers appeared, stretching from Delaware shell companies straight to offshore accounts in the Cayman Islands. I told the country club elite that they deserved to know exactly why their future president was so desperate for cash. I revealed that Harold had secretly liquidated his own retirement accounts to cover up a staggering $900,000 deficit in his golden child's household. He did this for one singular pathetic reason. He needed to preserve a flawless family image to win the presidency of this exact country club. I looked at the wealthy investors, local politicians, and board members in the room. I asked them directly if a man who would violently extort his own child and actively enable federal fraud just to win a social election was truly fit to manage their membership dues and fiduciary assets. Furious whispers broke out across the ballroom. The scandal was spreading like wildfire, consuming Harold's pristine reputation in real time. I saw a prominent local judge shaking his head in absolute disgust. A real estate developer Harold had been aggressively courting for a country club partnership literally pushed his chair back from the table. But I was not finished. The financial crimes were only the symptom of the rot inside my family. It was time to expose the actual disease. I tapped my screen for the final visual. The complex financial flowcharts vanished. In their place appeared a crystal-clear copy of a commercial residential lease agreement for a $25,000 a month penthouse located in Soho, New York. Right beside the lease document played a looping, grainy security video retrieved from a Manhattan street corner. I pointed to the screen and coldly narrated the footage. I told the crowd to watch closely as the dutiful, perfect suburban wife stepped out of a luxury black town car and passionately kissed a 20-something lifestyle influencer on the pavement. I stated that the $900,000 Harold was desperately trying to hide the money that required stealing my identity and tearing our family apart was not lost in a tragic cryptocurrency investment as they had claimed. It was being used to fund a secret, extravagant double life in New York City. I announced that Melanie was acting as a sugar mama, financing a secret lover with stolen money, and her parents were entirely complicit in the cover-up. I watched the absolute destruction of their social standing happen in real time. The wealthy socialites who had just been enthusiastically clapping for my father were now staring at Eleanor and Melanie with unvarnished contempt. People were pulling out their cell phones, discreetly snapping photos of the projector screen to send to anyone who was not in attendance. The board members sitting near the front began aggressively leaning away from my mother's table, physically distancing themselves from the radioactive fallout of a confirmed federal crime. Melanie finally broke. She let out a piercing, hysterical shriek, shoving her chair back so violently that it crashed into the waiter standing behind her. She covered her face with her trembling hands, sobbing uncontrollably, completely exposed beneath the harsh glare of the ballroom chandeliers. Eleanor grabbed Melanie's arm, desperately trying to pull her back into her seat and force her to maintain composure, but it was entirely useless. The carefully crafted illusion of the perfect, affluent Connecticut family had shattered into a million irreparable pieces on the polished hardwood floor. I stood at the podium, my breathing perfectly steady, my posture unwavering. I did not raise my voice once during the entire presentation. I did not shed a single tear. I delivered the social execution with the cold, calculated precision of a corporate auditor presenting a fatal liability report. I let the looping video of Melanie's infidelity play on the massive screen behind me, a silent, undeniable testament to their absolute moral bankruptcy. From the corner of my eye, I saw the heavy velvet curtains near the backstage area twitch. Harold had finally stepped out into the open. He was gripping the mirrored pillar for physical support, his tailored tuxedo looking entirely too large for his suddenly shrunken frame. The arrogant, commanding patriarch who had threatened to disown me just 5 days ago was completely gone. In his place stood a broken, terrified man staring at the definitive end of his entire world. He locked eyes with me across the expansive ballroom. I did not look away. I held his gaze and offered him a slow, chilling smile. He had wanted a public spectacle. He had demanded that I bend the knee and play my assigned role. I had simply rewritten the script. The silence in the room was suddenly broken by the scraping of a heavy wooden chair against the polished floorboards. From the very back of the grand ballroom, a figure rose to his feet. It was Malik. He had been sitting in the shadows entirely unnoticed by my parents or my sister, watching the digital autopsy of his marriage unfold on the massive projector screen. He wore a sharply tailored charcoal suit, looking every bit the successful and dignified architect he was. But his face was a mask of absolute terrifying calm. It was the kind of calm that only comes when a man has completely severed his emotional ties to the wreckage around him. The sea of wealthy socialites parted for him instinctively. No one dared to speak. No one dared to intervene. The collective gaze of the country club shifted from the scandalous video playing on the screen directly to the man whose life had just been publicly demolished and vindicated in the same breath. Malik walked with slow, deliberate steps down the center aisle. He did not look at the whispers. He did not look at Harold, who was still trembling by the velvet curtains. His dark eyes were locked entirely on Melanie. Melanie's hysterical sobbing hitched in her throat as she saw her husband approaching. Her tear-streaked face contorted into a mask of desperate, pathetic hope. She actually thought he was coming to save her, to shield her from the public humiliation, to wrap his arms around her and whisk her away from the nightmare. She reached her shaking hands out toward him, her diamond bracelets catching the harsh light. She stammered his name, pleading for him to understand, begging him to listen to her explain the video away. Eleanor, ever the calculating manipulator, immediately tried to stand up and intercept him. My mother reached out to grab Malik's arm, her face twisting into a mask of manufactured maternal concern. She opened her mouth to spin a lie to claim that the video was a deepfake, a cruel fabrication designed by a jealous sister. Malik did not even break his stride. He simply shot Eleanor a look so freezing, so profoundly filled with disgust, that my mother instantly recoiled and sank back into her chair as if she had been physically struck. Malik reached the VIP table. He stood towering over his weeping wife. He did not yell. He did not cause a scene. He reached inside the breast pocket of his suit jacket and pulled out a thick legal envelope. He tossed it onto the white silk tablecloth right next to Melanie's abandoned dessert plate. The heavy envelope landed with a sharp, definitive thud. Malik spoke, his voice carrying just enough volume to be heard over the dead silence of the ballroom. He told her those were the expedited divorce papers already filed with the county clerk. He informed her that his forensic accountants had successfully frozen their joint accounts and legally severed his architectural firm's assets from her fraudulent federal liabilities. He stated that he had already packed his bags and moved his belongings out of their house. He looked down at the woman who had stolen from him, lied to him, and publicly humiliated him, and delivered his final words. He said he was leaving her with the exact amount of respect she had shown their marriage, which was absolutely none. Malik turned on his heel and walked straight toward the main exit. He did not look back. He pushed through the heavy brass doors of the ballroom and disappeared into the night, leaving his toxic wife to drown in the absolute ruin of her own making. The heavy doors swung shut behind him, sealing the absolute finality of his exit. The resulting silence in the ballroom was so heavy it felt suffocating. Melanie collapsed forward onto the table, burying her face in her arms, her wails echoing across the crystal centerpieces. Eleanor was frozen, her mouth opening and closing soundlessly, completely paralyzed by the sheer, undeniable reality that her golden child was now a divorced, bankrupt federal suspect. I turned my attention away from the VIP table and looked toward the velvet curtains. Harold had finally found his footing. The shock had worn off, replaced by the desperate clawing instinct of a cornered animal. He stumbled forward, stepping out of the shadows and into the harsh light of the stage. His tuxedo was rumpled, his face a mottled, furious red. He raised a shaking hand, pointing a trembling finger directly at me. He shouted into the silent room, his voice cracking with panic. He screamed that I was a liar, a vindictive, unstable liar who had orchestrated a massive illegal cyber attack to frame his family. He yelled to the crowd, begging the board members to ignore the fabricated evidence on the screen, claiming I was suffering from a psychotic break and had hired hackers to destroy his reputation out of pure, unadulterated jealousy. It was a pathetic, flailing attempt to regain control. The country club elite simply stared at him with undisguised pity and revulsion. Nobody believed the frantic rantings of a man whose own son-in-law had just publicly served his daughter divorce papers. But I was not going to let Harold off the hook with a simple reputational collapse. I was going to completely dismantle the ground he was standing on. I leaned back into the microphone. My voice cut through his hysterical shouting with surgical precision. I told Harold to save his breath. I stated that the federal authorities were already in possession of his handwritten ledgers, the very ledgers Malik had removed from his home office safe just 48 hours ago. I watched the remaining blood drain entirely from my father's face as the realization hit him. His secret sanctuary had been breached. His physical proof of conspiracy was in the hands of federal investigators. His legs gave out slightly, and he had to lean heavily against the edge of the stage to keep from collapsing onto the polished floor. I told the audience that Harold's desperation to extort $900,000 from me was not just to cover up an affair, it was to prevent me from looking too closely at my own financial portfolios. I reached into my tailored suit jacket one final time and produced a thick watermarked document bearing the embossed seal of my grandfather's legal trust. I held the document up under the bright stage lights, ensuring every single person in the room could see the official notarization stamps. I announced to the silent ballroom that my grandfather, a man who actually built his wealth through grueling, honest labor, had always seen right through Harold's pathetic social climbing. I explained that when my grandfather passed away, he did not leave his sprawling Connecticut estate to my parents. He did not trust them with his most valuable asset. Instead, he placed the multi-million-dollar mansion into an irrevocable trust, legally designating Harold and Eleanor as temporary custodians. They were permitted to reside on the property only until the primary beneficiary reached their 30th birthday. I paused, letting the legal reality hang in the air. I looked directly down at my father, who was now gripping the stage floorboards, his breathing shallow and rapid. I stated into the microphone that I am 32 years old. A fresh wave of shocked whispers erupted from the tables. The wealthy investors and local politicians were rapidly putting the pieces together. I explained that my parents had actively hidden the deed transfer notices from the county clerk. They had been living in my house, sleeping under my roof, and hosting their lavish country club events on my property completely illegally for the past 2 years. They had orchestrated a massive identity theft ring and attempted to extort me because they were utterly terrified that I would hire independent auditors, discover the true terms of the trust, and kick them out onto the street. I turned my gaze to Eleanor, who was now clutching her chest, genuinely hyperventilating at the VIP table. I told her that she had spent my entire life treating me like a disposable asset, a disappointment who did not belong in her perfect, affluent world. I told her she had demanded I liquidate my entire future to save her golden child from the consequences of her own fraudulent actions. I reminded her of the exact words she had screamed at me in that very mansion just 5 days ago. She had told me I was no longer her child, that I was dead to them, and that I was banished from their home forever. I looked back at Harold. I unclipped the microphone from the wooden podium and took 2 steps toward the edge of the stage, towering directly over him. I kept my voice absolutely calm, devoid of any anger or malice. I delivered the final, undeniable checkmate. I told Harold and Eleanor that they were absolutely right. I was no longer their child and I had no family obligations left to fulfill. I stated that the mansion they were currently occupying was legally titled entirely in my name. I held up the crisp, heavy legal envelope I had obtained from my corporate attorney that very morning. I dropped it directly onto the stage floor right at my father's trembling feet. I told him that envelope contained a formal, non-negotiable notice of eviction. I announced to the entire ballroom that Harold, Eleanor, and Melanie had exactly 30 days to pack their belongings and vacate my property. If they were still on the premises on day 31, I would have the local sheriff's department physically remove them for trespassing. I did not wait for a response. I did not need to see my mother collapse into hysterics or watch my father scramble to pick up the eviction notice. The absolute destruction of their empire was complete. I dropped the microphone onto the wooden podium. The loud, resounding thud echoed through the silent ballroom. I turned my back on my former family, walked down the stage steps, and strode straight down the center aisle. The crowd of wealthy socialites parted for me instantly, their eyes wide with a mixture of shock and profound respect. I pushed through the heavy brass doors and stepped out into the cool, crisp Connecticut night, leaving the burning wreckage of their lives entirely behind me. 5 days passed since the gala. I was back in my San Francisco penthouse. Oliver had executed the emergency injunction, flawlessly clearing the illegal lockout within 24 hours. The view of the Golden Gate Bridge from my balcony had never looked so brilliantly clear. My corporate compliance suspension was officially lifted the exact moment my legal team handed the banks the stamped federal police reports and Malik's physical ledgers. I was back in my venture capital office, sipping a black coffee, quietly watching the massive dominoes I had tipped over finally hit the ground. The fallout on the East Coast was absolute and completely unsparing. The local news networks in Connecticut ran the scandal on a continuous loop. Harold had arrogant illusions that his country club connections and former banking status would somehow shield him from tangible legal consequences. He was severely mistaken. Oliver's coordinated delivery of the physical ledgers, the red-penned fraudulent loan applications, and the offshore routing numbers triggered a massive, immediate response from federal investigators. On Wednesday morning, a fleet of black government vehicles pulled up to the wrought iron gates of my Connecticut property. Federal agents from the Financial Crimes Division executed a sweeping, aggressive search and seizure warrant. Neighbors watched from their manicured lawns as agents carried out boxes of hard drives, financial records, and luxury assets. Harold's personal bank accounts, his remaining retirement funds, and his entire investment portfolio were completely frozen by the authorities pending a massive federal indictment for wire fraud, identity theft, and financial conspiracy. The prestigious country club he had sacrificed his own daughter to rule instantly revoked his membership. They issued a swift public statement completely distancing themselves from his criminal activities. The wealthy friends and local politicians who had attended his lavish dinners suddenly developed complete amnesia regarding his existence. He was stripped of his wealth, his reputation, and his freedom in a matter of hours. Harold was reduced from a towering patriarch to a disgraced, terrified suspect facing decades in a federal penitentiary. Eleanor was right beside him, her socialite status entirely obliterated, forced to watch her stolen empire crumble while packing her belongings into cheap cardboard boxes under the watchful eyes of federal agents. Melanie's carefully curated fantasy world imploded with equal brutal devastation. With Harold's accounts seized by the federal government and Malik's assets legally severed by his ruthless divorce attorneys, the river of stolen cash dried up overnight. The $25,000 monthly rent check for the Soho penthouse bounced spectacularly. The platinum credit cards she had used to fund her secret life were locked down and flagged as active evidence in a federal investigation. I received a comprehensive update from Naomi's digital forensics team tracking the immediate aftermath. The exact moment the funds stopped clearing Chase, the 20-something aspiring influencer did exactly what parasites do when the host dies. He vanished without a trace. He packed up his gifted designer watches, blocked Melanie on every single social media platform, and permanently changed his phone number. He did not leave a note. He did not say goodbye. He even posted a video from a private jet with a new, much older and significantly wealthier benefactor just 2 days later. Melanie was left entirely alone in an unpaid Manhattan apartment. She had no husband to provide for her, no secret lover to validate her, no stolen family wealth to shield her, and the terrifying, looming threat of her own federal indictment for grand larceny. The golden child had finally collided with the unforgiving concrete of the real world, and she possessed absolutely zero survival skills to navigate it. She had spent her entire 28 years believing she was untouchable because her parents would always buy her way out of trouble. Now, the bank of Harold and Eleanor was permanently closed, and the vault was surrounded by federal crime tape. I sat at my mahogany desk overlooking the San Francisco skyline and finally picked up my personal cell phone. For the past 5 days, I had kept it completely silenced and locked in a drawer while my legal team executed the fallout. I pressed the power button and watched the screen illuminate. The notification counter instantly skyrocketed, freezing the interface for a solid 10 seconds as it struggled to process the sheer volume of panic. 120 missed calls, 64 unread text messages, 32 frantic voicemails. They had tried every conceivable angle. The progression of their desperation was meticulously documented in the timeline of missed calls. They started with anger, on Saturday shifted to bargaining on Sunday, and by Wednesday morning when the federal vehicles arrived at the estate, they had descended into absolute groveling terror. I opened my voicemail inbox, poured myself a fresh cup of coffee, and pressed play on the first message. Harold was up first. The commanding, arrogant former bank manager, who had screamed that I was dead to him just a week ago, was now audibly weeping into the receiver. His voice shook with a pathetic frailty. He begged me to call off Oliver and the forensic accountants. He pleaded with me to withdraw the eviction notice, sobbing that the federal government had frozen his legal defense funds, and he could not even afford to hire a decent attorney to keep himself out of prison. He told me he was a proud man who made a terrible mistake to protect the family, and he begged his brilliant, successful daughter for a second chance. He actually used the word please. I listened to his entire agonizing performance without my heart rate increasing by a single beat. The next voicemail belonged to Eleanor. My mother did not bother with apologies or admitting fault. She went straight to her classic, weaponized guilt. She cried hysterically into the phone, her voice high and breathless. She wailed that the country club had completely humiliated her, that her friends were refusing to take her calls, and that she was currently packing her designer clothes into trash bags because she could not afford proper moving boxes. She demanded to know how a daughter could be so incredibly heartless to leave her aging parents to rot on the streets. She sobbed that she had given me life and that I owed her basic human decency. I deleted the message before she even finished her sentence. Then came Melanie, the golden child, the beloved favorite who had smugly sat at the VIP table wearing stolen diamonds, was now entirely broken. Her voice was barely a whisper hoarse from days of uninterrupted crying. Malik had officially served her with the divorce papers, completely cutting off her access to his architectural income. Chase had blocked her number and vanished. She was facing federal grand larceny charges completely alone. Melanie cried that she was just a stupid, confused girl who got in over her head. She pleaded for sisterhood. She begged me to remember when we were little kids, promising she would do anything I wanted if I just paid off the banks and made the federal investigators go away. She swore she loved me and that I was her only hope left in the world. I set the phone down on the polished wood of my desk. They were not sorry for the abuse. They were not sorry for the identity theft or the extortion. They were only sorry that they had picked a fight with a predator who possessed sharper teeth. They expected their tears to wash away 32 years of calculated cruelty. I sat back in my ergonomic leather chair and took a long, slow sip of my black coffee. The dark roast tasted exceptionally rich this morning. The bright sunlight reflecting off the San Francisco Bay flooded my newly secured corner office, illuminating the pristine glass walls and the towering stacks of successful venture capital portfolios sitting on my desk. I had spent my entire life chasing the elusive approval of people who viewed me as nothing more than a highly profitable inconvenience. They had demanded my absolute loyalty while systematically attempting to strip me of my home, my career, and my sanity. Now, as the recorded sound of my father sobbing echoed softly in the quiet room, I felt absolutely nothing but the profound, echoing silence of a closed chapter. I placed the ceramic mug down on a polished stone coaster. I picked up my secure corporate cell phone and opened the family group chat one last time. The screen was a chaotic graveyard of frantic apologies, desperate pleas for financial salvation, and terrifying realizations that their country club empire had officially burned to ashes. I did not type out a lengthy explanation of my feelings. I did not offer them a single ounce of closure or a detailed list of their unforgivable sins. They already knew exactly what they had done. They were just horrified that I had finally held up a mirror to their actions and forced them to look at the reflection. I tapped the glowing screen, my fingers moving with the precise mechanical efficiency of a surgeon completing a flawless operation. I typed exactly 2 words. Too late. I pressed send. I watched the tiny digital indicator confirm that the message had been delivered to Harold, Eleanor, and Melanie. Then, without a single moment of hesitation, I permanently blocked all of their numbers. I erased their contact files from my secure cloud drive. I initiated a hard, unrecoverable deletion of the entire group chat history from my device. I completely severed the digital arteries that tied me to their toxic existence forever. The phone screen went dark, reflecting my own calm, resolute face. The silence that followed was not empty or lonely. It was the heavy, magnificent sound of absolute victory. An hour later, Oliver walked into my office carrying a thick, leather-bound portfolio. He did not ask about the voicemails or the current status of my family. He simply placed a heavy, gold-plated pen on my desk and opened the portfolio to a meticulously drafted legal document. It was the master deed to the multi-million-dollar Connecticut mansion. The sprawling estate, where I had been endlessly belittled, the house where Harold had violently threatened to disown me, was now entirely under my legal jurisdiction. I did not want to sell it and absorb their dirty money. I wanted to transform that monument of generational toxicity into something entirely pure. I took the heavy pen and firmly signed my name across the bottom line. With that single signature, I legally transferred the absolute ownership of the entire property to a highly respected national charity organization that provided safe housing and comprehensive resources for survivors of domestic abuse and financial manipulation. Harold and Eleanor would not just be evicted by a local sheriff. They would be forced to watch their precious status-defining mansion become a sanctuary for the exact type of vulnerable people they had spent their lives exploiting. Oliver notarized the signature, gave me a sharp, respectful nod, and quietly exited the room. I stood up from my desk and walked over to the floor-to-ceiling windows. The morning fog had completely burned off, revealing the stunning, vibrant red span of the Golden Gate Bridge cutting across the sparkling blue water. I took a deep, unobstructed breath of the crisp California air. For the first time in 32 years, I was not carrying the suffocating weight of my family's expectations. I was not bracing for their next calculated attack. I was completely undeniably free. The story of Sienna navigating her family's profound betrayal teaches a vital and often difficult lesson about the true nature of boundaries. For years, she believed that enduring her family's toxic behavior and meeting their unreasonable expectations was the price she had to pay for their conditional love. However, when they attempted to extort her and destroy her career to cover up her sister's massive financial fraud, she realized that shared DNA does not give anyone the right to abuse you. The most powerful takeaway is that walking away from a toxic environment is not an act of cruelty, but a necessary act of self-preservation. Sienna did not seek mindless revenge. She simply stopped protecting her family from the natural consequences of their own actions. By legally securing her assets and severing all ties, she reclaimed her narrative and her future. We are often taught that we must forgive family no matter what. But this story illustrates that true freedom sometimes requires us to close the door on those who only view us as a resource to be exploited. If you have ever struggled with setting boundaries with toxic relatives, take a moment today to prioritize your own peace and remember that your well-being is worth protecting.